Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Star Fox 2. In the last part we started off hard mode and now we're in a returning planet from the first game. This is Fortuna, the water level, which isn't just an aesthetic thing this time around. In this game you actually can enter the water, what is sort of a foreshadowing to the Blue Marine stage in Star Fox 64. While you're underwater, the game does slow down to a crawl because of water physics, but the walkers actually do something a little fun while they're in the water, in that whenever you press the jump button now, they will then enter a swimming animation, and you can mash the button to just continuously swim up and up. The flight modes of your Airwings notably cannot be in the water though. They'll just bounce off the top. In fact, if you transform while underwater, your Airwing will shoot straight up to escape the water as soon as possible. This does lead to some very weird momentum though, in that while you're constantly swimming, your momentum constantly speeds up. This is also one of the few stages where the pepper coin is technically outside the stage's boundary for some reason. Don't quite get why, but oh well. Unfortunately, they don't use the water to much effect. It's more for aesthetics, I guess, in the long run, because, while yes, you can swim, the coin is all that you need to get down there in the water. There are some enemies, yes, and I think they can drop some items. There might even be an item you can find, period. But I'm very objective-focused here. And now we need to fight a kick gunner. We need to fight this thing a couple of times throughout the game. It's kind of an annoying mini-boss in that it jumps in and out of water pools. It jumps into one, it can jump out at a completely different one, it can jump out at the same one, but while it's in the water, it is completely out of your reach and invincible, which is why I'm not the biggest fan of these things. It's one of the few enemies that has a constant invincibility period. With that said, last time I mentioned there were bios in the game's quote-unquote manual that was on not only Switch Online, but also on the game's website, so might as well go over those. They're pretty brief. Fox McCloud is a capable leader who commands the unquestioning loyalty of the Star Fox team rather. Falco Lombardi is an ace pilot who enjoys a friendly rivalry with Fox. Peppy Hare is a seasoned veteran whose cool head and wisdom holds the team together. Slippy Toad is a somewhat jittery type who is prone to errors but hard to dislike. And then for our two new members, Miyu is an advocate of the old maxim, the best defense is a good offense. And Faye is the daughter of an aristocratic family. She has relinquished high society and taken up arms to defend her home planet. Hell yeah. Boss fight here is actually one of the few new ones we're going to see on hard mode on. The core itself is actually invulnerable for a good bit. You need to take care of some pillars around the side to take out the shield that's protecting it. With that said, once the core is vulnerable, it doesn't do much to defend itself besides the usual rings, which even then I think it has less health than most cores to begin with. Notably, Miyu as a character, while she doesn't show up again after this from memory, they did apparently in development take a lot of the characteristics they wanted to assign to her and gave them to Cat in 64. Minor, but still notable. Weird in some regards, actually in retrospect there's no Bill proxy, but oh well. There's also a Star Wolf bio, we'll go over that in a moment. You might have noticed last time there was this little, like, dual-pronged thing slowly heading for the satellite defense station. These are drones that are sent to take it over. You can intercept them to take them out beforehand, but I like to wait usually before they get to the defense station itself because they actually don't harm Corneria itself for a good bit. The reason for this is, the way they harm Corneria is by making the satellite defense cannon fire at the planet itself. Which is actually a limitation I haven't mentioned about the satellite defense station. It will not take aim at any particular missiles or, more accurately, squadrons that are already attacking the planet because it can damage the planet itself. But if that cannon, while it's possessed, gets activated and fires at the planet, that I think is the most damaging attack that Corneria can face in the game, so be careful. So another thing that Hard Mode Beyond adds is that once you take care of the first chain of planets, a second set of cruisers spawns in. These have their own medals, but by and large, they're the same as a lot of the other cruiser levels. Dash on in and get into them as soon as you can, and then watch out for obstacles on the way through and grab the singular pepper coin that's within them. In some regards, these might be some of my favorite missions in the game, if only because while they're limited and very quick, they are the closest thing this game has to missions that play like the original Star Fox, because by and large, you don't do just a straightforward flight mission in this game. These are the closest you get. And honestly, I think they needed at least one, maybe split Astropolis into two stages, like one stage is a flight to the city complex itself, that is the main final stage we actually have, and then you do that stage. But at the end of the day, I guess it didn't need it because the game is very much trying to be its own entity with the tactical elements, and I think it honestly does pretty well with them. Just would have been kind of neat. At the same time, though, I've mentioned it before, but I have a very weird approach to Star Fox because of the order I played them in. Like, I started with Star Fox 1, loved it as a kid on my dad's Super Nintendo, and then I got Adventures. And I loved Adventures as a kid, and I probably still like it now, I'll just like it less. Because I'll realize the control issues more. I'll get to that whenever I eventually get to that game, though. I like when Star Fox does things a little differently, though. Like, that's why Assault is probably my favorite overall. Also, that's another new boss. That is a core that you need to actively shoot a target to make the main core portion spawn in, while two, essentially, turret enemies spawn out of the pools on and off to shoot you. Pretty easy to take out quickly, but I would recommend taking care of the turret shooting at you first, just so you can make that go by all the more quickly and safely. Before I get back to the bios, though, something I do want to mention. The enemy squadrons in this game feel a little weird. Because for one thing, while they are randomly generated when they spawn, I think, depending on the difficulty. For one thing, if you're near an enemy squadron, I think they gun for you rather than Corneria. But their speeds seem to vary, and I want to say that's dependent on the enemies that are within that squadron. But there's a part of me that also wonders maybe, and there's probably information out there to confirm or deny this. I'm assuming it's probably not the case, and I'm just making this up because it just is what my brain's noticing trends where there aren't any, so to speak. What it could be maybe is that when you destroy the cruiser a squadron spawns from, they start meandering, getting a little lost, but I feel like I'm making that up. Alright, so back to the bios, let's talk about Starwolf at this point in time. Not much is known about the shadowy squad of unscrupulous mercenaries known as Starwolf. Bankrolled by Adros, this 4-person team are wanted and feared throughout the galaxy and will stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Starting off, we got Wolf O'Donnell. This despicable criminal will betray anyone for the right price. Then we got Leon Powalski, an inscrutable and sinister alien. Pigma Dengar is arrogant and cruel and possessed of a fiendish strength. And then there's Algae. Rumored to be the most devious creature in the cosmos, he exploits the weakness of his targets with merciless precision. Okay, in this battlecruiser we have a new mini-boss. This is the Heavy Chariot. This is a giant pair of wheels that rolls at you, and eventually it unfolds itself to show its cockpit, at which point it'll fire a couple times at you. The big annoying thing with that is that it does a lot of contact damage because its main attack when it's not firing at you is to just roll at you. You need to make sure that you are constantly backing up. There are some fights in this game you can do slightly in the battle stations and all that. As a flyer, I wouldn't recommend doing it in most of them, and especially that one, because the perspective will just not work with you while you're actually fighting it. It's weird. Like, difficulty-wise, yeah, we got the 3 difficulties, but I'd say on the whole, this is overall one of the harder Star Fox games. Not so much for the individual stage difficulties, but the processes of multitasking here can really build up on top of your health not restoring between stages. If that happened, which it probably shouldn't anyway, that would be an entirely different conversation. Like, I'd say overall the hardest Star Fox game is, from my perspective as someone who never finished the game, at least got all the endings at least, I think I maybe got one ending. I think the hardest one is Star Fox Command. That's just such a radically different game for a lot of it, just like this one is. So those two being the hardest would make sense in that regard. Like, yeah, there's hard parts in 1 and 64, especially if you're going for like metal ranks and all that. And there's some missions from Star Fox Assault that haunt my nightmares to this day, despite probably not being as bad as my memory makes them out to be. I would just need to revisit the game because I haven't played some of those games in a hot minute. Like, Star Fox is a series that was always there for me growing up. It's just not when I actively suck out as much. Playtime is over. Destroy the weaklings. Alright, we got a new near end of difficulty mini boss here. There's a couple of these. The Mirage Dragon is one of the ones that can show up, and they can show up on all difficulties, I think. But on higher difficulties, you run into one like the Hunter Fantron here. This is meant to be a follow-up mech to the one from near the end of Star Fox 1 on some of the pathways. This thing can be annoying because one of its main attacks is to collapse its hands together, and not only does that do a lot of damage, it's really hard to dodge unless you actively try to boost or break away from the mech, and boosting is the main thing you're going to want to do there considering, well, we're in space. It does try to keep a consistent distance, or at least it keeps itself obvious to see, but then it starts spinning around, and in this field it's hard to deal with. There are some fights you'll see me throughout the LP swap my camera point of view from the first person to the behind the back. There's a couple of reasons I do this back and forth. In some fights, I think it's easier to get around some attacks or see my targets in behind the back. Whereas sometimes there's attacks that are easier to dodge from first person because of how I think your hitbox works between the two. Because I think when you're in third person, the hitbox is just the plain outright. I want to say it's a little different in first person, but I might be completely wrong about that. It might just be a thing they did for performance reasons more than anything. Alright, I know we were speeding up the dogfights overall. The only dogfights throughout the rest of the game that's not applying to is Wolf, because he's sort of a more important boss in the long term, I guess is the way I'm going to look at it. The thing I'm split on recommending when it comes to dogfights is whether or not you should just do charge shots or actually, like, mash the fire button to get individual shots in. Because, frankly, when you just mash fire, especially on Tomb Blasters, you do have a higher chance of actually hitting the enemy on higher difficulties, especially, because they can just easily deflect your single charge shot on most occasions. But the damage from a charge shot is just that worth it? I guess the big thing to do is whether or not you're actively doing multiple playthroughs of some of these difficulties, because once you've gotten every pepper medal on a difficulty, using charge shots does become the best way to play basically any of these boss fights, but that's because of a reason we'll discuss next part in particular. Now, something I'm not sure if I've covered yet in the LP, it's sometimes because I actually record a single video's commentary over 2 days, just in case, like, it gets too late or I get distracted. Whenever you reach, particularly this Star Wolf fight, on any given playthrough, at that point, your damage meter for Corneria is locked in because nothing more can damage it, because you've taken care of all sources of damage the game will throw at it. So if you made it this far, congrats, you've made it past the hard part no matter what. With that said, something I've never tested is what happens if you run out of time while in Astropolis. I do not know what happens. I'm assuming it's still just a game over at that point. But it's worth noting that time will still tick up no matter what you're doing. So in the case you're getting real low on time and you're in Astropolis, make sure you head straight for the boss fight. Just to get as much done as you can in as little time as you have left. Thankfully for this playthrough, we're doing pretty good. We're on this particular run of hard mode, heading towards Astropolis, and we have 79 time left, so to speak. But like with normal mode, we're not tackling Astropolis this part. We're going to be ending hard mode there next time. There's still 3 whole planets we have to show off for hard mode and grab the pepper coins in, and getting this particular layout of planets took a little bit. Because like I mentioned, both in part 1 and basically every video since, the planets that get selected whenever you start a playthrough are random. So you can have any situation and any set of planets show up. It's just always 2 of the 4 on normal mode, 3 of the 6 on hard, and there's an entire different set of situations going on in expert mode. And I want to say getting this particular layout of the remaining 3 planets I had to show off took me like 10 minutes of just resetting and starting the game over again, which entails sitting through the intro, sitting through the title screen, choosing the difficulty, seeing the intro cutscene, sometimes choosing your characters, and then resetting from there. Not that that's really going to matter on your own playthroughs unless you're just trying to do the game in as few runs as possible. If you're just playing through every difficulty as you get them and doing multiple runs, just being like, yeah, I'll play the game again today, you're probably going to have the other difficulties show up eventually no matter what anyway. And even then, in order to get the true ending, quote unquote, where you beat expert mode, you don't need to play every planet. You just need to unlock expert mode, which I'll talk about how you do that next time, and then beat that difficulty. Meteor here is pretty easy on all 3 difficulties, so if you're playing along and you're only going to try to do 1 playthrough of each, this is a good stage to have show up no matter what because it's pretty safe. Enemies aren't going to be a big worry about. Pepper coins are pretty easy to nab in most cases as well. I'd say overall probably the hardest of the levels consistently is Fortuna can be a little annoying. What's the next level we're tackling? I think Macbeth can be a little bit of a troublesome place. And you know what? Venom can bring the danger even if it looks a lot safer than it did back in Star Force 1. But it's mostly on the higher difficulties that Venom gets really annoying because of a very particular enemy that can show, particularly on expert mode, which we'll talk about next time. Also, I guess I can mention this now. What's kind of interesting about the 3 difficulties is that they were meant to be 1 difficulty lower, so to speak. On the game design documents I mentioned that they revealed for the game, that is like where a lot of people found maps for the pepper coins. The difficulties are originally marked as easy, normal, and hard, but then they just corrected them to normal, hard, and expert. Which I think is a better description of them on the whole, because like I mentioned, I think this is one of the harder Star Fox games just for the stress of dealing with the real-time stuff. And Command would revisit that and all that jazz. For now, though, let's get back to speeding up through this difficulty until we get to our next new level. I actually wasn't sure if this is how I wanted to handle the LP for a while. Like if I wanted to show the full playthroughs of each secondary run and all that. I settled on this mostly just because you see what the main playthrough's like on the first run of every difficulty. At this point, it's just so I can showcase the levels in the case you get these if you're playing along. Is why I eventually settled on doing it like this. For now, though, it's time for Macbeth, which is our fire level. This kind of works like Solar later would in Star Fox 64. In that the lava is outright damage. You don't have to swim in it, it's not like water in that regard. Stay away from it. However, you can be close to the lava and you won't take damage. The radiant heat thing from the Solar level in 64 isn't something to worry about here. Although bonking your head on stuff can be somewhat worrisome. Now right there you saw a little bit of something funky with the game's control and physics. Whenever you start transforming from the Airwing into the walker, your momentum does just completely stop. And there are times where the game is a little funky with how it handles that. Where sometimes you just stop and you can hold left or right and you'll fall that direction, you can land on a platform. There's times where it feels like the Airwing will actively follow moving platforms below you so you can land on them. And then there's times where you need to time landing with the walker, which doesn't feel quite right when you transform. Thankfully, there's only a few times that happens to begin with, and you're not guaranteed to get that planet anyway on some difficulties, but it's a little weird. The base here on Macbeth kind of annoys me, though, because while the overworld section of the stage isn't much to worry about whatsoever besides the lava being pretty high in damage from memory even, the base is one that has a mini-boss I briefly foreshadowed and talked about earlier in the LP. It is my least favorite mini-boss to fight in the game. It's the Night Knack. The Night Knack is a giant walker robot that has one gigantic shield it constantly holds in front of itself. However, what makes this particular mini-boss annoying is that it's easily the best at avoiding circle strafing in the game. It keeps pretty good pace with you whenever you try to rotate around it, to the point where the best time you can actively attack it is when it's attacking you. Using a smart bomb can get around some of this from memory. But what you might want to do, particularly in this room arrangement, is actually use the harmful laser in the middle of the room to your advantage. It can't damage the enemy, but it can get stuck on it and can't exactly walk through it in some instances. So if you just kind of use it as a shield to block its attacks and then try to rotate around it slightly, you can do some good stuff with that. I don't know, shielded enemies, particularly when the shields are this effective, have always been one of the more annoying types of things to fight in games, period. Like, I immediately think back to the Arkham games. The shielded grunts in those games were usually some of my least favorite enemies to fight, only because they, even with the way they had to get around them, they always felt like they were the most awkward part to pace around with in a singular combo if you're going for certain challenges and all that. It was either them or the ones you had to do the... I think it was the larger enemies. You had to do like the 1, 2, 3 cape swing to super stun them. Always felt a little weird. Thankfully, though, the core at the end of this is not much to worry about because you've dealt with so many cores to get to this point usually anyway. Although it really does depend on, A, how much of the game you play up to this point, but also just what plans you get on any given playthrough, because you might completely avoid this particular type of core, period. Which does make up for some really interesting stories in this game, because literally any time you play it is different in a way that still feels like you're playing a substantial amount of the game. Because that's why I'm not the biggest fan of roguelikes and roguelites on the whole. Like, yeah, mechanics can evolve and you can get stronger and stronger, but a lot of the times, while levels might have individual mechanics, a lot of things feel samey. Like, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon was the only roguelike I liked for a while on the whole. Like that, and I did like Hades when I played that. But with that, I'm gonna need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 5, we're gonna go finish off hard mode. See you guys then.